Coming in at number 5, we've got the Master. You know, this guy came damn close to ending the world through vampirism. Hell, he basically infected all of New York with his strain. The Master comes from the series of books turned TV show The Strain, penned by Guillermo del Toro and Chuck Hogan. Basically, it is a virus that is very similar to ancient vampirism. It spreads quite quickly, as viruses tend to do, and puts humanity in peril. So by putting this strain in motion, the Master deserves every ounce of fear he gets. He's been alive for millennia, taking multiple different forms over many lifetimes. The Master has been a Roman slave, an iron worker, and most recently a Polish man with gigantism. As one of the original vampires, the Master has all sorts of unique strengths that other vampires in this universe don't. One of the most terrifying of these powers is the ability to see through the eyes of all lesser vampires. This allows him to surveil any area that a vampire is in. It's also great for protecting himself and seeking out prey. He's also just ridiculously strong. Like, way stronger than any vampire has any right to be. He'll crush your head with his pinky if he wants to, don't try to fight him. And even if you're confident in your combat ability, he's got some wicked shadow-based teleportation abilities. If he steps into the dark, he can just dematerialize and rematerialize all over the place. It's crazy. And to top it all off, he's more resistant to sunlight than most vampires. He's not totally immune, but he can definitely roam around a little in the sunshine. So you can't rely on the UV rays to take him down. To make matters worse, he's got a master plan to turn all humans into blood banks. After collapsing the internet, he makes it to New York and makes some key alliances and plans on transferring his consciousness to a new host. Then he'll take out the high-level finance folks and build processing plants for human collection. Yuck. I mean, I guess the bankers get what's coming to them, right? Coming in at number 4, we've got Viktor. A powerful warlord in life, Viktor was once a ruthless military leader who ruled over his land with an iron fist. This extended well into the afterlife as well. Upon his deathbed, the first vampire Marcus Corvinus came to Viktor with an offer. He would give him eternal life if he helped lead an army of immortals against the werewolves. Viktor, loving life and combat, accepted this offer and became one of the most terrifying vampires of all time. This is the vampire who betrayed Marcus, waged war against werewolves, and even killed his own daughter. You don't want to mess with Viktor. He, like many vampires in Underworld, possesses superhuman abilities of the highest caliber. His strength is unmatched along with his speed, and he can endure almost any injury. Even if grave wounds are inflicted, Viktor can heal up quickly and keep on moving. He can also snag memories from those he bites, giving him insight into all sorts of secrets. These military conquests and supernatural powers are all terrifying on their own, but Viktor's shrewd politics are possibly the most dangerous thing about him. After living for millennia, Viktor is well versed in the ways of the world and knows how to take advantage of many situations. He is cunning and manipulative and knows how to act swiftly and brutally to get what he wants. If Viktor wanted to end the world, he doubtlessly could. As he says, the dangers of the forest are not greater than those of the council. You must learn the dance of politics to be ruthless and cunning. Those are the words of men who could ruin the world if he chose to do so. Coming in at number 3, we've got cars. That's right, folks, the Pillar Men are vampires. They drink blood, sunlight hurts them, they can make more monsters like them, they're super ancient, they have superpowers, and now we're talking about JoJo's Bizarre Adventure on Top 5 Scary. Way to go, team. Of course, Cars is the most powerful of the Pillar Men. Just look at how Joseph had to deal with him in Battle Tendency. After learning that he is truly immortal and not even the sun can destroy him, JoJo literally fires him into space to freeze up and float around for the rest of eternity. That is a crazy powerful vampire. Like a lot of the other vampires on this list, Cars has superhuman strength, speed, and regeneration, but those powers are augmented by a connection to the world around him. He can sense all sorts of things that are invisible to the naked eye, changes in air pressure, tiny sounds off in the distances, rising temperatures, all seen by the all-seeing Cars. Plus, he's infused with the DNA of everything on Earth. He can evolve on the fly, always putting him ahead of the competition. Plus, he's got some wicked poses. Like, what other vampire can pull off so many model-esque looks? That's what I thought. Coming in at number 2, we've got Caine. The first vampire in the mythos of the World of Darkness is also the most powerful. Caine is the firstborn son of Adam and Eve and was cursed with vampirism by God as punishment for murdering his brother. After this, he was sent out to wander the land of Nod. During this time, he met Lilith, who gave him some of her blood to drink. By partaking in this blood, Caine is visited by 3 angels who bestow curses on him after he refuses to repent for the murder of his brother. He becomes awakened and possesses new disciplines, granting him untold power. He eventually settles in a city and becomes the Dark Father. He took on followers who became like children to him. If he embraces them with the gift of immortality, they become vampires too. Soon there's an entire city full of generations of vampires, and then an empire. Caine ruled over it all from an ivory throne. Thanks to having such longevity, Caine has mastery over all of the disciplines, and his abilities outshine those of any other vampire. He can also cancel out the disciplines of any vampire near him, guaranteeing his power in any situation. And finally, coming in at number 1, we've got Gabriel Belmont, also known as Dracula, but I wanted to make sure everyone knew that we were talking about Castlevania. There are plenty of powerful men and monsters throughout this universe, but the Prince of Darkness reigns supreme. Once a vampire hunter, he knows all of the tricks of the trade, making him even harder to deal with. He's got void, chaos, and blood magic, covering all sorts of potential matchups a burgeoning Dracula killer might throw his way, and that's just the start of it. He can shapeshift into all sorts of legendary creatures, he can possess humans to do his bidding, he can turn into freaking smoke and travel crazy distances in no time at all. He's so resilient he survived an explosion that took out an entire continent. There really is no competition when it comes to all-powerful vampires. Hell, he even uses the vampire killer cross to end Lucifer. This vampire can kill immortal beings. His consistent appearances in all sorts of Castlevania media speak to his longevity and versatility too. There really is no vampire like Dracula, and this iteration in particular has what it takes to destroy everything countless times. Those damn Belmonts have plot armor. I think turtlenecks should make a comeback this year, not only because they're comfy and stylish, but because they hide your vulnerable throat flesh from potential vampire threats. Toss a silver chain on and hide a stake in your belt and you're good to go.
Kicking off at number 5, I Am Legend. Zombie vampires. Who knew that such a hodgepodge could become a genuinely terrifying hallmark of literature? Well, for those of you that have read Richard Matheson's phenomenal 1954 sci-fi horror, I Am Legend, you'll know that's exactly what it is, genuinely terrifying. And although it was a half-decent movie, please don't lump this novel in with the 2007 Will Smith blockbuster, because the entire film kind of missed the point. But hey, that's not why we are here, is it? Written by Richard Matheson, I Am Legend tells a tale of Robert Neville, a reluctant scientist and the sole survivor of a vile pandemic that has ravaged the planet, a blood plague that seemingly turns humans into vampires. Throughout the opening of the novel, it is alluded to that this plague was a result of a devastating war, and this plague was openly spread via mosquitoes kicked up in the subsequent debris of society, which, you know, is already a pretty terrifying notion, because that could happen. Now, I won't get into too much detail about the actual narrative because there is a lot to be enjoyed in this novel, and if you can get your hands on it, I'd highly recommend reading it. It's not too long at all, and Matheson paints a vividly bleak picture throughout. The reason that I Am Legend's zombie vampire plague-ridden carriers end up on this list though is because of Matheson's attention to scientific detail, and as Robert Neville scours the wasteland of Los Angeles, learning more about the swarms of fleshy, bloodthirsty rippers that roam the streets at night, we're gradually given a real sense of physicality as to the bleak feral existence Matheson's vampires are subject to. And I won't even go into detail about the ending without fear of spoilers, but if you're partial to a bit of existentialism in vampire literature, then please read this novel because its ending is a whole different kettle of fish. It will make you think twice about vampire folklore and the legend that comes with it. I Am Legend. Swinging in at number 4, Fevre Dream. Again, if you're in the mood for a fantastically written, relatively concise novel about terrifying vampires and the resounding implications that come with immortality, please read George R.R. Martin's fantastic 1982 novel, Fevre Dream. And yes, that's correct, before George was weaving Westeros and creating perhaps the finest fantasy series ever written, he was also indulging himself on immortal vampires that commandeered a Mississippi riverboat in the mid-1800s. Yeah. Now, if I had to choose purely from a technical perspective, Fevre Dream may actually be one of the most complete and compelling works of vampire fiction ever written. If you're a fan of Martin's prose, then you'll find exactly the same kind of verve and style here, and what it serves to do is wholeheartedly humanize his immortal vampires and turn them into a much more complex kind of monster. Like with most of Martin's work, there is no black and white here, but instead shades of grey, and as you may imagine, that's a pretty difficult thing to do with vampires. However, the reason it only makes its way in at number 4 though is that purely from a horror perspective, it's not entirely as terrifying as some of our other entries, but in terms of depth and complexity, Fevre Dream is second to none. It tells the tale of Abner Marsh, a grizzled steamboat captain in the mid-1800s, who is down on his luck during a particularly bleak financial crisis, but is then contacted by a mysterious, soft-spoken aristocrat, a man named Joshua York, who promises to finance a brand new riverboat for Abner, an opulent vessel named Fevre Dream. And whilst obviously yes, this novel is centered on vampires, I'll say no more because because the way the immortal society of vampirism is woven into this novel is a beautiful thing to witness, and the subsequent opposing blood masters that are spawned from it is a concept rarely looked at in vampire fiction. 2 words: Vampire Jesus. Next up at number 3, the Vampire Court. And whilst throughout the fantastic Dresden Files series by Jim Butcher there are many forms of vampires and the subsequent vampire courts that come with them, there's no doubting that the most terrifying, malevolent and purely evil vampire organization is the White Court, although thankfully for us they're all pretty damn evil anyway, and Harry Dresden has been doing his damnedest to bring about their downfall one by one, as is the case with the Red Court. Sorry, spoilers. Now, vampires in Jim Butcher's universe come in many different shapes and forms, almost like a melting pot of pretty much every vampire custom and creation that we've seen in fiction, which is pretty damn awesome in its own right. But it's with the societal structure and ancient hierarchy where Butcher's vampires truly shine. The White Court, for example, is an order of vampires that feed purely from human emotion, and they satiate their hunger through the consumption of essentially the human spirit. Because of their propensity for life force rather than actual human blood, the White Court prefers to avoid any direct confrontation with their enemies, and for the most part they're a court of schemers and ploy makers hidden within the shadows, pulling the strings. Essentially, the White Court are the East Indian Trading Company of the vampire world, and they pull the strings on the rest of the blood-sucking immortals around them. On the other hand though, there was also the Red Court, a vile sect of fleshy bat-like humanoid creatures that use the glamour of a skin mask to disguise themselves as humans, living and preying on society for years on end. As more akin to the traditional vampires of legend, the Red Court were particularly dark in their approach to feasting off of human blood, and operated mainly in Central and South America, where they reared entire villages of humans like cattle to feed upon. Then there's the Black Court, a diminished sect of vampires who were essentially born from the stereotypical Dracula of legend, but were hunted and eventually destroyed thanks to Bram Stoker's novel, which in Butcher's universe was published as a how-to guide for the layman to hunt down and kill vampires. Don't you just love the Dresden Files? Swinging in at number 2, the Wamphyri. We cannot make this list without laying down Brian Lumley's incredible Necroscope series, and I'm fully aware that many of you Top 5 Scary viewers are particular fans of his resounding horror series. The thing is though, Lumley completely shook up the concept of what makes a vampire so fervently that in some cases it's hard to tell where monster of folklore legend begins and alien parasitic monstrosity ends. And believe me, don't worry, I say that as a good thing, not a bad thing. In Lumley's Necroscope series, first written in 1986, gone are the classic interpretations of the vampire legend, and instead Lumley's vampires are a leech-like parasite from an ancient world deep in the cosmos. Through a painful and grotesque process, these alien leeches attach to their host and begin a symbiotic life cycle that grants them their immortality of legend, as well as many other devious superhuman machinations. What makes Lumley's Wamphyri so awesome though is that they're essentially the vampire version of Marvel's symbiotes, and their life cycle is wholly similar to that of a fungal creature, transforming its host through a slow spore-ridden process that turns them into the immortal villains that populate Lumley's Necroscope series. Because of that incredibly unique process though, the Wamphyri leeches can also infect other non-human entities, such as in a few cases foxes or wolves, and then so begins Lumley's absolutely awesome fictional explanation as to the nature of werewolves and lycanthropes that populate his horror series. It's never been done before. The thing is, in Necroscope, the Wamphyri are so damn ancient and so adept at understanding the parasitic process that created them. In the later series, they move into an entire industry of breeding lesser versions of vampires to enact their bidding, whether across the earth or on Starside. In fact, Lumley's depiction of vampirism in the Necroscope series is pretty damn bleak, and the one true evil against humanity are the Vampiri, because eventually even the most purest of hearts succumb to their evil will. Also, vampire cannibalism. Yeah, that one's not been done that much before. And finally, coming in at our number 1 spot, the higher vampire. And whilst we're talking about hunting vampires, we cannot talk about bloodthirsty monsters in literature without taking note on the resounding works of Andrzej Sapkowski with the Witcher saga that rightfully deserves its place at our number 1 spot. Now, in my opinion, Sapkowski's depiction is the most complete, compelling and intriguing creation of vampires in horror, in the whole of literature. And I know that's pretty damn hyperbolic, but really, if you've read his work or played any of CD Projekt Red's fantastic video game series, you'll know exactly the impact that vampires have on this world. And I say world because the most intriguing notion of vampires in the Witcher saga is that, not unlike Lumley's Necroscope series, these ancient entities are from another planet entirely. Well, not exactly another planet, so to speak, but another dimension, another sphere. Now, I'll try not to spoil anything, but to be fair, speaking about the conjunction of the spheres isn't exactly giving anything away. In Sapkowski's world, vampires aren't created or turned learned or otherwise conjured into existence, they're born, just like humans are, and exist as corporeal beings who can manipulate their body at a molecular level in blood and matter just as easy as we can breathe. Over 1,000 years before the Witcher saga began, during the conjunction of the spheres, different realities where monsters and magical entities reside freely on their own plane collided and merged with our world, which eventually necessitated the need for the Order of the Wolf and the many witches that came with it. As you know, someone had to try and keep a lid on all that chaotic magic going on, right? Cheers, Geralt. Honestly, I could speak about the Witcher saga all day, but as far as vampires are concerned, there is so much to feast on. The Bruxer, the Catacan, the Alp, grotesque mutagenic versions of vampires created from humans and the corporeal dimension beings that are absolutely terrifying. Regis, the awesome ancient vampire who's best friends forever with Geralt, the unseen elder, the list goes on and on. And if you're a fan of vampire fiction and are yet to delve into the works of the Witcher series, please consider this as a reminder, because as far as vampires are concerned, there's nothing else like it, and it's the best for a reason. Kicking off at number 5, the Nosferatu, 30 Days of Night, which has been a long time coming really, and this is a 2 for the blood price of 1, because the fantastic 2007 movie starring Josh Hartnett is reason enough to check out this fictional portrayal of vampires, and I've no idea why that film gets so much hate, but it's awesome. For this particular entry though, we'll obviously be focused on the 2002 graphic novel series created by Steve Niles and Ben Templesmith that tells the tale of the unwitting town of Barrow, Alaska, the northernmost settlement of the frozen north that for 1 month every year is cast into complete and utter darkness. And that, as you may imagine, means one thing and one thing only for vampires: an all-you-can-eat buffet. Yeah, whilst it's an exciting and incredibly fresh premise, which it is, it also features one of the most genuinely compelling depictions of vampires in modern fiction. And to do that, it does away with the age-old beauty and serene mystery often captured in vampire fiction, and instead it turns them into beasts, creatures that are far more similar to sharks than they are of the average vampire. And it works. The most telling of these is Vincent, the antagonist of the series, although in the movie he is depicted as Marlowe. As it explains, Vincent's vampire, otherwise known as the Nosferatu, were once ruled by an elaborate council of elders who, after deciding to reveal themselves to the human race, were completely destroyed and persecuted, dwindling to only a handful of vampire survivors. After a millennium, Vincent led his vampire in secret, lingering in the shadows of the world until humanity had completely forgotten about their kind, maintaining themselves as creatures of just myth and legend. Now, I won't spoil anything, but obviously that kind of goes awry, mainly down to the fact that they messed with the wrong damn town, but still, they're awesome. In the series, vampirism is portrayed as a virus which is spread through contact with vampire blood. It kills those afflicted by it, turning an infected human undead, where they grow a mouthful of shark-like fangs and bleak, lifeless black eyes. Obviously then you've got the superhuman strength, acute hearing and sense of smell, teleportation, telepathy, glamour, the ability to resurrect your burnt ashes via a single drop of blood, but that goes without saying at this point. Vampires. Swinging in at number 4, every vampire ever, Anno Dracula. Whew. Yeah, this one is as equal parts in depth as it is awesome. Now, if I said to you, what do you think would have happened if in the events of Bram Stoker's Dracula, instead of saving the day and all of humanity, Van Helsing is defeated by the vampiric overlord Count Dracula, ushering in a brand new age where vampires rule the entire planet in a secret, shadowy coalition? Well, Anno Dracula answers that very question, and the result is a wholeheartedly captivating series that just so happens to portray perhaps the most malevolent vampires of all time. Well, I mean versions of themselves, because what Anno Dracula does to hammer home the reality of the matter is take pretty much every vampire that you've ever seen in literature and then give them a brand new position in the hierarchy of the global vampire to varying effects. By scale alone, Anno Dracula is staggering, but the real fear lies in the reality of its alternative history, because, guys, Dracula marries Queen Victoria. And don't worry, that's not spoilers, really, believe me. And geez, we haven't even started talking about the wider series yet, but yeah, written by Kim Newman in 1992, the first entry of his series Anno Dracula focuses on Dracula's rise to power in 1888, following the death of Van Helsing, where he spreads his overwhelmingly powerful vampire curse, creating thousands of new vampires and taking them all to England. Soon enough, he marries Queen Victoria, as you do, and ushers in a brand new period of vampire-led political domination of the United Kingdom, where he rules from the shadows under a vampire orchestrated police state. Not only that, but Jack the Ripper makes an appearance alongside Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Diogenes Club, who are scheming their way back to human safety. There's a crack group of Carpathian mercenaries loyal to Dracula. Sherlock Holmes shows up, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde too, Count Orlok, Lord Ruthven, Elizabeth Bathory, for crying out loud. Hell, even Lestat de Lioncourt from Anne Rice's novels makes an appearance. Seriously, if you love both history and vampires, Anno Dracula does it like no other. And talking of Lestat, next up at number 3, Anne Rice's Vampires, The Vampire Chronicles. And I hear you guys, I know a lot of you called for these particular bloodsuckers to make an appearance, and whilst we held off a little down to their overwhelming popularity, shall we say, there's no denying the fact that Anne Rice's vampires are considered a staple of the genre for a reason, because they're really good. That's the truth of it. They're everything we want from vampires. Ancient creatures, a rich, complex mythology that spans the entirety of human history, supernatural creatures with incomprehensible power, and you know, they're also pretty attractive. Unless you get trapped beneath the sands of ancient Egypt for a few thousand years, but that's by the by. They scrub up pretty well. And there is perhaps no other vampire in the series that scrubs up better than Lestat de Lioncourt, given the fact that the man survived off of swamp lizards and rats for several decades, and still managed to come off smelling like roses. But although Lestat is indeed a symbol of the ancient gluttony of vampirism, the real ancient terror lies in the deep interwoven history of Anne Rice's vampires. As first mentioned in Rice's 1985 novel The Vampire Lestat, and later elaborated on in her 1988 novel The Queen of the Damned, the first vampires of the series emerged in ancient Egypt, their origin mysteriously tied to an energy force of ancient spirits that existed long before Earth. Here, a bloodthirsty shade known as Amel grew infatuated by two young witches that lived on Mount Carmel, and before long, Amel took Makare as her familiar, bestowing on her the first powers of vampirism. But then Queen Akasha of Egypt grew jealous of the witches' new power and burned their village to the ground. She imprisoned them and tortured them, eventually cutting out their eyes and tongue respectively, but in time Akasha's own bloodlust attracted the shade of Amel instead, and alongside her husband King Enkil, they became the divine parents of all vampires. Eventually they faded into legend of the vampire world, but it was thought that if Akasha died, all vampires would die with her, as the shade of Amel would no longer have a vessel. Honestly, the mythology of the Vampire Chronicles is kind of second to none. It's so rich and beautifully woven that its tapestry of ancient vampirism reads almost like the scriptures of some long lost civilization. Let's hope not. That's food for thought. Coming in at number 2, the Strigoi The Strain. Because whilst the ancient immortality of an entire civilization of vampires is terrifying enough, what's even more terrifying are those ancient vampires conducting an unnatural war on a global scale, perpetuated by a deadly strain of a vampiric virus, orchestrated by the malintent of an ancient rogue vampire known only as the Master, who is pretty much Vampire Hitler. Yeah, and don't expect the highly stylized feasting of Anne Rice's vampires, because in The Strain, if you're unwittingly turned into a Strigoi against your own will, you've got a gross little worm wriggling inside you, and no one wants that. In fact, it's the physiology of the Strigoi where the terror truly lies, because more so than any other vampire species, these guys are just straight up gross. I really mean that. They're really, really nasty. And the strain quickly becomes more of a biological horror with a sheen of the supernatural more so than anything else. And yet, whilst the machinations of the Master and his takeover of an order of ancient vampires is need for concern, seriously, all you need to do is witness a mature Strigoi and you can fill in the gaps for yourself. Put it this way, as explained by the legendary Guillermo del Toro, the creator of the series alongside Chuck Hogan, the Strigoi are more akin to the Aswang of Filipino folklore, and if you know anything about those horrifying creations, you'll pretty much get the picture very quickly. After being affected by the capillary worm, the human host genes are rapidly manipulated, causing the victim to undergo numerous radical physical changes. The most distinct of these is the development of a long, retractable probe-like appendage referred to as a stinger that acts as the new vampire's feeding and reproduction mechanism. It shoots forth to latch onto a victim, draining its blood and then infecting the human with more gross capillary worms. And yeah, that's pretty much the end of it all. As the cycle continues, the Strigoi lose all physical traits that are obsolete to its new life cycle. They shed hair and fingernails, their nose and ears fall off, the skin becomes as smooth and featureless as marble, their middle finger grows elongated and a single sharp talon protrudes out. Yeah, seriously, body horror and vampirism has never been more vivid than in The Strain. Give it a read or give it a watch, because it's really gross. And finally, coming in at our number 1 spot, The Grandfathers, The Dark Tower. And yes, because truth be told, there are few fictional representations of vampires that are as genuinely terrifying as those penned by Stephen King. And although the vast majority of this entry should be specifically tied to that of his 1975 novel Salem's Lot, we also have to feature the wider expanded world of Stephen King's vampires, and the most powerful of them all Type 1 vampires, as elaborated on in the wider world of the Dark Tower. Now essentially there are 3 types of vampire in King's Macroverse. Type 1, the most powerful, Type 2 and Type 3. Simple, right? Also, spoilers, because here we can't talk about Type 1 vampires without referencing the brave and tragic tale of Father Donald Callahan. Now, if you've read Salem's Lot, that name will sound incredibly familiar, but Callahan, through his trials and tribulations as a newly created vampire, learns a whole host of horrifying truths about vampires. And as it turns out, Kurt Barlow was merely a very small fish in a very big pond. A blood-sucking fish, of course, but that's by the by. Now, purely from a narrative perspective, King has a way with words that seem to capture the innate terror of what a vampire truly represents, that although they seem frighteningly similar to what we think we should know about vampire lore, pale skin, strange eyes, long teeth, drinking blood, they're also incredibly alien, and that's the fine balance that King seems to capture to staggering effect. They're the literal definition of otherworldly creatures, and particularly as the town of Salem's Lot discovers after Kurt Barlow sails upon the shores of New England, because even if you do manage to survive one of the most powerful Type 1 vampires of the New World, unfortunately for Callahan, there's plenty more where that came from, because the most terrifying of them all are the Grandfathers, an order of ancient evil that are so impossibly powerful that a host of parasitic bugs follows them wherever they go to feast on those that they slaughter. Do you know how overwhelmingly evil and powerful you need to be to create an entire ecosystem of insects? These guys are only ever alluded to in one particular scene of the Dark Tower series, and I'll say no more because it's nightmare fuel enough. Yeah, that's reason to take our #1 spot. The Grandfathers. They just sound creepy, don't they?